The national grid transmits electricity to homes, communities, businesses, and industry. Its network of cables is vast, with nearly 4,500 miles of overhead lines and underground cables that would get you from Land's End to John O'Groats and beyond. It even extends into continental Europe. Opened in the 1930s, the UK's national grid was a world-class pioneering project. Cutting-edge innovation revolutionising the way power was supplied to people.
By the end of the First World War, people would get their power supplies from the local coal mine or the local ironworks. So there were a huge number of different suppliers, 600 suppliers by the mid-1920s.
We're about to explore how building a nationwide electricity infrastructure fueled our insatiable appetite for energy, how a growing demand for power drove remarkable advancements, but also exposed before unseen vulnerabilities in our energy security.
We've just had an immense shock caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. Gas prices went haywire.
I'm Clare Nasir, and this is Inside Energy, a podcast by Ofgem, exploring how the energy we use today has evolved and how it will change in the future.
The national grid was primed for success. The national grid was lucky.
This is Dr. Jonathan Aylen, a visiting senior researcher at the Manchester Institute of Research.
It came along at exactly the right time when the technology all came together.
In the 1920s, much of the country's network was in disarray. The UK's electricity supply was highly fragmented.
And that's to say, it quite literally did work sometimes on a parish-by-parish basis. People would get their power supplies, for instance, from the local coal mine or the local ironworks. They'd supply the local villages. And so there were a huge number of different suppliers, 600 suppliers by the mid-1920s, nearly 900 power stations.
The system was inefficient, and this often led to different standards of service for customers. This prompted a report into electricity supply across the United Kingdom, chaired by Lord Weir.
When the Weir report came in 1926 demanding a national grid, not only was everything in place, the technology, the people, but it was a time of recession. And so therefore they were able to roll out the grid from Scotland to southern England really very quickly. There was plenty of spare capacity, for instance, in the shipyards to build the grid towers. There was plenty of spare capacity to make the aluminium. And so it came in below cost, ahead of schedule, at a time of recession when employment was very much needed. One of the key recommendations of the Weir Committee that set up the national grid was standardisation. There was standardisation on the type of current, standardisation on the frequency of that current, and standardisation on the voltages for transmission across the country.
By 1934, the grid was essentially complete as a set of regional units, and after many more tests, it was brought together in 1937. The timing turned out to be critical.
In 1938, there was a very cruel winter, particularly in London, and for the first time, power flowed from the north to the south to prevent power cuts in London. So by 1938, the grid had definitely proved itself as a way of producing reliable electricity supplies for the nation.
By the outbreak of the Second World War, the provision of electricity was the foundation for the war effort on the home front.
We relied upon electricity for lighting, particularly for heating, and it was central to the war effort, which was a war of production. We needed to turn out the aircraft, the fighter planes, we needed to turn out the ships, we needed to turn out the tanks and so on. All this relied upon a grid supply to drive the manufacturing machinery.
After the war was won, ambitions of a higher-powered grid began to emerge.
The grid as originally conceived by the Weir Committee was actually a low-power grid. Why? Because that suited Britain with all its local coal mines and its local power stations that were then brought onto the grid. But it was recognised, particularly from America and Germany, that you got perhaps more efficiency and perhaps less transmission loss from a higher voltage grid. And so the supergrid came in 1953, the 275 kilovolts. And that was generation 2, if you like, of the national grid coming in, as a result partly of wartime experience.
In order to achieve that goal, more organisation was necessary.
They were bought under public ownership so that they could be integrated far more closely one with another, and that they could plan power station provision centrally across the country, and indeed plan grid development centrally across the country. And that's exactly what happened. So the Central Electricity Generating Board came into play, and they became responsible for coordinating both power station construction and the new supergrid. And in particular, they built a large number of coal-fired power stations in places like Nottinghamshire, where the coal was prolific, and electricity quite literally began to flow southwards towards the population centres like London and the home counties. The grid and the whole electricity system has continued evolving quite markedly. One development was the building of nuclear power stations, which gave a very solid base load to the grid. But since then, of course, we've had wind power and, to a much lesser extent, solar power coming in.
Although that diversification brings new challenges, particularly around fluctuations in what gets generated. In order to alleviate this, a set of subsea interconnectors extends the UK national grid to Europe. So, on a calm day in Britain, when it's windy, say, in the Netherlands, the UK's lack of wind energy can be compensated by tapping into the power through cross-channel links. It helps provide the constant flow of energy we've been accustomed to, even with increasing demand.
We go back to when the grid was founded, 1926. The amount of electricity consumed was minimal by today's standards. If we then scroll forward 100 years to today, we have seen a 50-fold increase in electricity use. And it is a situation where we are far more dependent on electricity than we were when the grid was conceived 100 years ago.
Having a national grid and a constant supply of energy into our homes is something we take for granted. But what happens when it all goes wrong?
The UK has kind of come in and out of periods of extreme energy security and extreme energy insecurity.
You'll remember Dr. Ian Wereley from episode 1. Ian is an oil industry expert at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada.
So in the age of coal, the UK was dominant, had the highest amount of the best quality coal. And then the shift to oil actually created a deep and intense insecurity.
Britain had moved away from coal because oil was cheaper and easier to transport. Along with other Western countries, it got its oil supply from the Middle East.
And this began in the first decade of the 1900s, so around 1906 to 1910. European and British interests, geologists, company executives aggressively sought control over Middle Eastern oil.
Rich London businessmen like William Knox Darcy were negotiating hard for oil concessions.
Darcy's company was founded as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which eventually became British Petroleum, or BP. So that legacy there's a direct line between the initial discovery of oil in the Middle East to the companies today.
But through the mid-20th century, resentment was brewing. Local populations were conscripted into labour from building refineries, pipelines and infrastructure, and were seeing their hard work being turned into profits going elsewhere.
A lot of the oil-producing countries in the Middle East attempted to disrupt this Western-dominated system several different times. And at each time, it was kind of thwarted or narrowly avoided. So the whole cycle continued again of this resentment. A deep, deep resentment was building during this period.
Not that energy companies saw it coming. Professor Ian Fells was an advisor to Edward Heath's government.
I was at a lunch at Chatham House, and it was quite a distinguished lunch.
Chatham House is the home of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It's where some of the most influential and powerful people go to share ideas behind closed doors, frankly and confidentially.
And they had there the chairman of BP and the chairman of SO and all sorts of people. And a chap gave a talk, and he said, in his opinion, the price of oil could have multiplied by 10 within 10 years. And this seemed inconceivable to everybody present.
But events were conspiring that make what seemed inconceivable become a reality. Dr. Ian Wereley again.
There was huge amount of tensions around the world with the Cold War, intense competition between Western powers and the Soviet Union. In the Middle East, we also had a huge tension with conflicts such as the 1948 founding of Israel, the 1967 Six-Day War, which really contributed to a volatile geopolitical situation in the region.
It reached a boiling point in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, which was triggered when Egypt sought to reclaim parts of the Israeli-occupied Sinai Peninsula.
This was originally seen as kind of a regional conflict, but the United States and its allies kind of entered the fold and supported Israel. And this was again seen as drawing a further contrast between that us, them, insider, outsider, east, west. So in response to this seeming intervention by the Western powers, OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which was predominantly led by Saudi Arabia, imposed an oil embargo on the United States, Canada, the UK, the Netherlands, Japan, Portugal, and South Africa, and a few others, but those were the major economies, and basically just refused to export any oil to those countries.
The embargo extended from October 1973 to March 1974, 6 months that sent shockwaves across the global economy. Oil prices quadrupled, inflation soared, economies around the world plunged into recession. Professor Ian Fells again.
The atmosphere was serious worry. When your electricity supply begins to become back, almost everything stops.
Prime Minister Edward Heath imposed a 3-day week to save energy supplies.
As far as industrialists concerned, the 3-day week was a real nuisance, and it cut down productivity.
One of the main consequences of the oil crises was this ripple effect that went through the global economy. And so that affected everything from transportation costs to manufacturing costs to wages to employment. And so, again, there's a lot of changes and shifts happening in societies around the world at this time. And then to add to that, all of these disruptions and uncertainties around the resource that makes the entire world run really it just sent shockwaves throughout every economy in the world. And this was a moment in the 1970s and then subsequently into the 1980s where all of the variables that could go wrong did. A lot of the short-term policy decisions didn't change the situation on a micro level, but on a macro level, lots of policy changes came into effect in this period. We start looking at deep sea drilling, the oil sands in Canada, shale oil, Arctic drilling, a huge shift to the creation of what are called strategic petroleum reserves, the strong push towards nuclear energy that took place in the 70s and 80s, which was, again, an effort to diversify and to move away from places that were unpredictable and unreliable. So you see the rise of the four-cylinder, the Kias, the Toyotas, the Hyundais, which now pretty much dominate the small car market here. The rapid development of the Japanese electronic industry was, in a sense, a response to the threats posed by an oil-based economy. So you really see it across, again, the daily life. You have the growth of ideas of conserving energy, reduce, reuse, recycle, the programs of the 70s and 80s focused on acid rain reduction. And these are all in some way related to this catastrophe that happened in the 1970s.
While While Britain and other Western countries have sought to diversify and move away from this over-reliance on oil and gas, it still remains a huge part of our energy mix. And we're still exposed to the ripples that geopolitical events can cause.
We've just had an immense shock, rivaling the original oil price shock caused by the Russia-Ukraine war.
This is Director General of Infrastructure at Ofgem, Akshay Kaul.
Gas prices went haywire in 2021. Energy bills went from averages of about £1,100 a year to something like £4,500 a year. And that's why this shift that we're making from a dependence on gas to produce power to clean sources of power, to a largely renewables-dominated power system is so important. But obviously making this transformational shift does impose some costs, because you have to make the investments in a completely new generation of assets.
So as Ian Wereley noted earlier, part of this initial diversification in the 1970s and 1980s was nuclear power.
Yes, nuclear energy has the immense strengths that it is, once you've built it, it is extremely cheap to run. It's very clean to run. And by and large, it's very safe to run. And it's very, very reliable. So nuclear power is the classic baseload, what they call baseload technology, which you can just put on and then keep on throughout the day, throughout the year. And that it forms the base bedrock of your power system supply. And then everything else then can get added onto it to serve peak demand. And we saw in the subsequent decades really a big push from the Central Electricity Generating Board, as it was then, to develop nuclear power in the UK.
Nuclear power, though, was not without its problems.
Its principal disadvantage was that A, it took a long time, so it was costly to build, and B, at the end of the life of these nuclear power stations, you would have to find a way of storing the waste products from nuclear power. And so there was a degree in the public consciousness, a sense of unease about how you do that. And then, of course, I think we had a few accidents, which became very big in the consciousness of the public. Chernobyl being obviously the biggest one of them, 3 Mile Island, starting to get people to worry about the safety of nuclear power stations.
As we heard in episode 1, the discovery of natural gas in the 1960s brought a cleaner and more accessible alternative to oil and coal for heating. And by the 1990s, it was quickly becoming the principal fuel for power, sidelining nuclear growth and pretty much replacing coal. Improvements in combined cycle gas turbine technology made gas-fired power stations more efficient and cost-effective. Stricter pollution control measures made natural gas, which burns cleaner than coal, a more attractive option.
The so-called dash for gas that occurred in the late 90s was, I think, quite a transformative moment. Gas-fired power stations were cheaper and quicker to build than nuclear power stations, and that's why they became the principal alternative to coal-fired power. Gas was also, at the margins, cleaner in terms of emissions compared to coal, and by the time we got to the late 1990s, I think the movement had become established fairly well in terms of trying to reduce carbon emissions. It hadn't quite become the thing that it became in the noughties, but it had become relatively well established. I think one of the most significant things that the regulator did at the time was to permit the regional electricity companies to start signing long-term contracts for gas with the gas producers. And that's what really shifted the dial, because essentially the regulator committed energy consumers to paying for long-term construction and operation of these gas-fired plants.
Privatisation of the energy markets brought an even greater dominance of gas.
This was a policy pursued by the Thatcher government to take what was a vertically integrated, state-owned energy system and split it up into its component parts, and wherever possible introduce market mechanisms and competition, and where competition wasn't possible to introduce the regulation of private monopolies. But essentially the whole idea was that combination of competition and private capital and private enterprise would bring dynamism and efficiency into what was seen as quite an expensive and inefficient and perhaps over capacity or excess capacity sector by the late 1980s. And the outcome in the first 10 years or so of privatization was indeed that costs came down, By the time you get to the turn of the century, we had introduced competition in the generation markets for power. There was competition for gas, for production, as well as for the supply of electricity, particularly for large consumers. And by the time you get to about 2010, we had sort of opened up the retail markets for power, even for residential customers. So you could start to choose which energy supplier supplied you with gas and electricity. So competition really had a big sway in policy and regulation through that 1990 to 2010 period, extending into virtually every aspect of a previously state-owned monopolistic energy industry.
Such huge shifts in the provision of energy in the UK meant that the way the industry was regulated would need to change too. And that's where Ofgem comes in. In the next episode, we'll hear more on how our modern-day energy needs are catered for. Plus, climate scientist Dr. Emily Wallace talks to us about the challenge ahead and the need for change.
One of the main tasks in terms of decarbonising our energy system is swapping fossil fuel generation to renewables. And of course, once you've done that, the energy we're using is the weather, and the weather is notoriously variable. So that means that we really need to make the system work around that. That means that we need to use much more storage.
My thanks to Dr. Jonathan Aylen, Dr. Ian Wereley, Professor Ian Fells, and Akshay Kaul for their expert insight on this episode. If you enjoyed it, share it with someone who also might like it. I'm Clare Nasir. Inside Energy is a Bengo Media production for Ofgem.